sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Keep Yale out of politics and focused on education. Sign our petition today, calling on Yale to adopt institutional neutrality. Truth should be Yale's mission, not commenting on every political controversy of the day. Sign the petition at fightforyale.com/institutional neutrality.
Tickets are now on sale for our annual Disinvitation Dinner on May 9th at the Pierre in New York City with noted speaker and human rights activist Ayon Hirsi. Get your ticket today at buckleyinstitute.com/disinvitation 2024.
For this week's episode, we'll be talking about how America's cornerstone institutions like higher education are falling apart. For this discussion, we've got our student panel all lined up, including first-timer Owen Tilman, a freshman.
Good to meet you all.
And returning to the podcast, Claire Barragan-Bates, a junior.
Good to be back.
And soon-to-be graduating senior, who we'll miss dearly, Aron Ravin.
Yep, I'm back again.
So, for American society to survive, let alone thrive, we rely on a large number of institutions not in the physical sense, like a bank or a building, but kind of in the more abstract sense, right? The family, our community, just the basic networks and ideas that allow us to trust each other, that help society function. And we rely on these institutions to help society move forward and grow. One of those key institutions is obviously higher education, one which we all know about. You guys, by your participation or your being students at Yale, and me through my work at the Buckley Institute. So the question I have is Yale doing its part as an institution within society? Is it still fulfilling the role that you guys expect of it?
I like Yale. I go to Yale. I don't plan on dropping out of Yale right before I graduate. But what I will say is I think that one of the problems with how Yale has been selling itself in the broader American context is instead of trying to create the Yale man or Yale woman, as it once actually tried to, it's kind of become this place where it advertises itself as a place for someone to find themselves. They don't actually care about making a particular kind of value system in the people who attend it, which I think is a problem. However, what's made even worse is that they subversively at the same time do propagate a value system, but they do it in a way that's dishonest. Like, when one comes to Yale, they're constantly bombarded by DEI politics, some other left-wing agenda, but they're not open about it. And because they're not open about it, it makes it harder to engage with it and actually push it into a better direction. I think Yale should be making people into better people, like in the value sense, but it's not. And I think that disappoints me.
I would agree with that. I think that universities ought to be places of truth and authenticity. After all, we are here to learn and we are here to cultivate knowledge. And I think that that's something that universities are sort of losing in the modern day.
So do you guys think that the university is failing in its institutional mission?
Absolutely. And I think that, this is not even a conservative point at all. I think that somebody like Fareed Zakaria of CNN made this point back in December in response to the 3 college presidents who were testifying before Congress and fell all over themselves when asked a very simple question of whether or not they condemned the genocide of Jews. And it's absolutely, I think, to Claire's point, inauthentic, and to Aron's point, very dishonest the way that they go about it, because it's pushing, I think, a political agenda and an agenda to sort of engineer people socially and politically under the pretext of this very relativistic sort of open politics, which is obviously not the case. And I think this also, in terms of specialization and the institutional mission, is a bit of a problem, because it's like, no, these institutions are not meant to take a political stance. I don't want to know whether or not Yale, what Yale as an institution thinks about Israel and Palestine. I just want to rest assured that I'm able to have an open and honest dialogue on Yale's campus, which is the whole point of an educational institution in the first place, is to be a place of excellence.
So, Aron and Claire, is higher education, we'll leave Yale aside for the moment, is it failing in its responsibility as a societal institution?
I think that there is a failure that's inherent in universities' choice to take political stances on things. Universities ought to be politically neutral spaces where people, as Owen was saying, are able to engage in dialogue about issues. But I also wonder where this push has come from for universities to become political.
So I was actually going to ask that very same question. Do you guys have any thoughts on like what's driving this change?
I think one thing that a lot of conservatives get wrong is they say that universities are what are like corrupting the youth, or that they're making kids leftist. No, kids are coming to universities as leftists. Like Yale is extremely talented at selecting high achieving students, and like to the point about whether universities are failing, to at one level they are still producing highly effective economic agents. But what they failed to do is they failed to actually get conservative students, not because they don't exist. I wrote a wildly conservative admissions application, and I still somehow got in. But what is the case is that the kids are becoming like far left agents. I remember during in 2020, every Instagram story was about this kind of nonsense. And the fact of the matter is I think that university administrations are terrified of these students. These students are the ones that shut down them. There was just recently a series of arrests that happened at our police station, at our train station, because the students are extreme. And I think like even if they aren't going to get violent or stage a sit-in, administrators are really just uncomfortable by the fact of seeing what happened with Christakis or with anything like that. They're scared of what these students are capable of, so they succumb.
Do you guys think there's some kind of, I guess, like sui generis change in like the student population that Yale is responding to, or even afraid to respond to? Does Yale and other higher educational institutions create that kind of culture that the students then respond to, and the students who want to get into Yale then respond to?
So just very super quick on that, I think Yale really cares about promoting an activist culture. And I don't mean activists in the sense of like politically leftist activists. I think they also like conservative activism. It's just the reality is that also leads to a selection for more leftist types because most activists are leftists.
One thing that I wonder also is that a large population of professors are also leftists. So I think that maybe it's sort of like what came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the professors indoctrinating the kids with leftist ideology, or is it the kids coming into Yale already as leftists, and then they just sort of spiral deeper and deeper into that hole where they're not willing to hear other viewpoints? That's why I think that the small conservative community at Yale needs to be a lot louder.
Yeah, I mean, I love the analogy of the chicken and the egg because it is a difficult question. And I think something that people have to contend with is the fact that, look, these universities, even before 2024, for a long, long time, have always skewed heavily in one political direction. I don't think it's just students coming to Yale and then demanding, that their professors succumb to their wishes. I think the administration also has taken it upon itself to push these policies onto students, and it makes for a very difficult experience if you don't fit the orthodoxy.
I totally agree. And just to bring it to DEI, I think that DEI policies among student bodies really perpetuate this, that it starts with like the domestic policy inside the institution and in the selection of students that come to universities like Yale or higher ed universities. I think that DEI policies obviously favor a certain demographic of students that tend to be leftists. And they also make it so that there's certain topics and things of that nature that are just off limits. So there's certain viewpoints that one might have on certain political issues that are just unacceptable.
So I guess we'll take this a little bit outside the Yale campus, or outside the university campus. These changes, do you think they're going to impact the rest of society?
Oh, I think they already have. And I also think that there's a reciprocity there because, now I'm going to interject Yuval Levin, of course. But he's talked about this extensively in the context of Congress, right, where, you're elected to do a very specific thing, which is legislate. And an implicit sort of expectation there is that you prioritize negotiation, you prioritize strategy, you prioritize in any given moment being effective more than being right. Now what you have are people who use it as a platform, who use it as a stepping stone, who use it as a chance in a committee hearing to have a breakout moment or a viral moment, right? And social media has obviously accelerated that exponentially. And now, right, people basically just talk right past each other. When you watch a committee hearing, it's basically just people, it's basically just people insulting each other with rehearsed talking points. And it's basically like a theater, right? They're just reading off of lines. And that, I think, is emblematic of that lack of respect for specialization, right? That is what binds an institution together.
It's almost like Aaron mentioned, the Yale preference or predilection towards accepting activists, whether they're conservative or liberal, taken to Congress.
Yeah, there's this premium that we're privileging to anyone who is willing to be loud on any issue. Being the Henry Kissinger type, where you're quietly in the shadows or like actually being effective, is no longer in vogue. It's better to pontificate in some committee hearing to try to get a soundbite.
Do you think that kind of lesson is one that students who go to Yale or people who watch Congress or watch, an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Marjorie Taylor Greene, like they learn that lesson? They see like, oh, if I want to be successful, this is the way to do it. Be loud, be obnoxious, be in people's faces.
100%. Like, I think that's like the entire university protest culture. Like, don't get me wrong. Protesting is an integral part of the American political system and should exist. But when people are protesting foreign governments in a university that will neither hear nor care about what they are saying, when they're totally uneducated on the issue, the thing that's being valued is one's symbolic content, not what they're actually moving for or striving for to make something better. It's virtue signaling.
I agree with that. There was recently a protest that was happening on campus, and I remember that I took a video of it and I sent it to Aaron and some other people in like our friend group, and I was like, oh my god, this is clown world. Because it is. No, but seriously.
What was the protest?
It was about Gaza.
Oh, okay.
But it was very loud. They shut down the streets. I was walking home from class.
I cannot think of a more ineffective protesting technique than shutting down a street.
Yes.
That makes me want to vote against whoever's shutting down the street.
Exactly. I agree. It really is about optics, and it's also really ineffective when they do that because they're not marching on the Capitol with people that have any actual political power and these sorts of things. They're just being loud in New Haven, where nobody can even really do anything about the situation.
But let's just be super clear. These are the people who are going to be in incredibly high positions of power in society and will be running institutions and be, in government and be running corporations. And this is the machine that's funneling them into society. This incredibly activist, virtue signally, that's not an adjective.
Sure.
You get the point.
I get it. Yeah.
You get the point. But it's that kind of machine, and that this is what they're producing. But it's not like that doesn't have any impact on society. It does. Having a Yale stamp right next to your name automatically gives you a crazy amount of credibility in virtually every important circle of power in society. So it's obviously important that we're producing the best people to come out of these universities.
Right. So I do want to ask about that because you guys do go to Yale, and you guys aren't lording it around in everyone. But at the end of the day, we all know Yale students often ends up in positions of leadership, or I guess you do it the reverse.
Unfortunately, yeah.
A lot of people in positions of leadership have gone to Yale disproportionately. So that means some of your classmates, some of them who shut down a train station or like protest a professor during a lecture, are going to be making decisions in the future. What needs to be done to kind of change this culture where that kind of activity is rewarded?
I think Yale has totally abandoned all of its disciplinary measures for anything other than very specific academic offenses, which, don't get me wrong, we need the academic offenses, see Harvard. But we what we're seeing at Yale is students are able to violate classrooms, and there was even a Blumenthal came to visit Yale, and then he was speaking to Yale Democrats, and then it was interrupted by protesters. It's like if Blumenthal doesn't cut it, I don't know who does. There's a wanton disregard for order. There's a wanton disregard for any concept of culpability for when someone does anything wrong. And until Yale actually decides to start punishing people for doing the wrong thing again, then people are going to keep doing the wrong thing. Yale doesn't do anything to encourage people acting on some level of decorum, because it's always easier to heckle than it is to have a good conversation.
Owen, Claire, what do you guys think? What's the solution?
I agree with Aaron's points. I think that the enforcement of rules needs to come back to universities. I think that spaces like classrooms need to be respected as places that people choose to be, to learn from that professor, and not used as like political marching grounds.
Yeah, off the dome, related to that, I think it was really good that the Buckley program invited Kate Branch and Judge Ho. Judge Branch, Judge
Elizabeth
Ho.
Branch.
Elizabeth Branch, yes, forgive me. I think they were really powerful examples of how people from outside of universities can impact the culture. I think we've seen like a lot of hiring managers react to some of the extremist, like pro-terrorist narratives that we've had like certain Yaleys advocate for. Like, it doesn't need these disincentives or these like enforcement of basic understandings of decorum to come from the universities. It should come from universities too. But people outside of them can do certain things, and it does actually lead to an improvement in discourse.
So is there hope for the college campus? Is there hope for the country?
This conversation's evidence of it. And what conservative, as well as just moderate liberal students like me, frankly, need to do is to not insulate ourselves and not create safe spaces of our own, not create counter safe spaces. We need to be spreading these messages to people and recognizing that a lot of these messages, such as pro-free speech messages, pro-institution messages, pro-basic decorum and decency and all of that, these are not political messages. They're framed that way to I think, deflect from the original point, and that is we are an institution, right, an educational institution at that needs to prioritize our fundamental mission, which is the pursuit of truth. And the best way to facilitate that is through open and honest dialogue.
I really think that engaging with the university, or the university populace, no matter how painful it might be, frankly, is necessary.
I think increasingly all the reasonable people in America are fed up with what's coming out of the Ivy League. And if there's anything that Yale cares about more than anything, it's its ranking in U.S. news. And as soon as Yale realizes that it's not going to be able to continue to do what it's doing and get successful placements and be as prestigious as it wants to be, then it's going to start changing its attitude. Things are getting better, and we need to keep sounding the alarm bells, not just on our campuses, but outside of them.
Claire, Owen, Aaron, thank you so much for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale. As always, appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, with that, let's get right to our interview with the American Enterprise Institute's Yuval Levin, who has spoken to the Buckley Institute on numerous occasions. Definitely an all-around favorite. It's great to have him back. Yuval Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the founder and editor of National Affairs. He's a senior editor at New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. And I'll say, every time our Buckley Fellows get to talk to Dr. Levin, they always have rave reviews, whether it's here in New Haven or down in D.C. They always have great things to say afterwards. So thank you so much for joining us here on Pod and Man at Yale.
Well, that's great to hear, and thank you very much for having me.
It's our pleasure. Really a pleasure. So in full disclosure, the first half of this episode is a student panel, and they're talking about the same issue we're going to talk about, which is the state of our institutions. The inspiration for this episode really was, the students met you a couple of weeks ago in Washington, D.C., and the discussion was so animated, and they really loved talking about it. So we thought, why not give the students a chance also? And then we're not going to, grade their perspective against yours, obviously, but we figured we would get your advice also. But the question of institutions, this is something you really pioneered. You brought this into the public discussion. How'd you settle on the subject?
Well, my thinking about it really began from the sheer fact of our living through a social crisis in America, a crisis that presents itself in a variety of different kinds of symptoms that are clearly connected and yet not obviously enough connected. So things like political polarization and the intensity of our culture wars on the one hand, and breakdowns in people's personal lives on the other hand that suggest that we're facing a crisis of the personal, whether that's rising suicide rates or an opioid abuse epidemic. It seems as though something is breaking down. And I think we have a tendency when we think that way to see our society in very individualistic terms. And so to say we're having trouble connecting. And so we talk about breaking down walls or leveling playing fields. There's truth to all of that. I think it's important. But what it misses is that our social lives are functions not only of individuals connecting, but also of the structures, the shapes of how we connect. And I think that our society is not just full of individuals, it's full of these structures of social life and social action. And those structures are institutions, right? Some of them are very formal and they have a kind of legal existence, like a university or a business. Some of them are much more informal, but are really crucial in our lives. The family is an institution, a profession is an institution, the rule of law. We see right through these things. They're invisible. And so I do think that it's important to surface them, to see them, because ultimately, if they are what is broken, then we're going to have a lot of trouble recovering without helping them. And I think that a lot of the challenges we face, whether it's a loss of trust, whether it's a loss of cohesion, solidarity, are really functions of institutional failures. And to address those, we first of all have to even see institutions. And in a free society, that takes work.
And I think to that point, one of the issues I had, or the challenges we had in discussion with the students, was really understanding what an institution in that sense is. So how would you define that?
It's a really important question, and it's very challenging. I think of institutions as the durable forms of our common life. So institutions are the shapes, the structures of what we do together. An institution is not just a collection of people, it's a collection of people organized around a common purpose. And that purpose gives each of them a role in relation to the institution and to each other. So think about a family. A family has a set of goals, above all, to raise the next generation. And in relation to those goals, one person is a mother or a father, one person is a grandparent, one person is the child. Each of them has a particular place in the life of that institution, a relation to its purpose, and a relation to the other people. But when you confront a particular situation in your life, a choice that demands real thought, it makes sense, I think, to begin by asking yourself, what is my role here? In what institution am I operating? What's expected of me? What's offered to me? What role do I have here? And so when you face a difficult decision, you don't just face it as an individual trying to make yourself visible in the whole society of 300 million people. You face it as a worker or a manager or an owner. You face it as a student or a teacher. I think a lot of what we mean when we say we've lost trust in institutions is that people have lost the knack for starting with that question when they face a difficult decision. And so rather than ask themselves, what's my role here? They might ask, what do I want? Or how do I want to be seen? Or what are other people doing? These are all relevant questions. But by beginning from what's my role here, we begin with a sense of responsibility. And I think over and over in American life now, we find people acting in ways that leave us asking, how could that person have done that? That's not what the president does. That's not what a priest should be doing. And that's because those people did not begin by asking, what role do I have here? And, that's a question that requires us to be conscious of institutions.
So kind of on that point, one of the debates, I guess, between some of the students on the panel was, are institutions constraining or are they liberating?
Well, I think that the answer is both, but that seeing that requires us to understand liberating in a particular way. I think there's a tendency to think about liberating as just removing all constraints. Do whatever you want. The fact is, do whatever you want is not actually liberating. It's terrifying. And what institutions do for us is they allow us to actually be free in a way that is empowered. You can't do that on your own. You can't do that by being a completely loose, free, isolated individual. Sometimes we imagine that's what we are. Ironically, we imagine that especially when institutions are working well, so that we don't have to think about them. And it seems like, well, we're just doing whatever we want. But the fact is, a world that lets you act on your own choices is a world with very strong and functional institutions, with all kinds of guardrails and protections, with all kinds of people who are there to facilitate your choosing. And those institutions liberate us. They do liberate us, but they also constrain, right? And I think that there is a way in which constraint can be liberating, in which constraint can say, this is the role you have, and you have a set of options, and the decisions you make matter here. Let me give you an example from the professional world, right? So this especially relates to trust, this relation between empowering and restraining. Why do we trust people? Why do we trust a scientist? I think we trust a scientist not because that's somebody who's good at math or knows a lot about chemistry. We trust a scientist because that is somebody who says, this is what I know and this is what I don't know. And this is how I move from not knowing to knowing. Scientists are often people who take a kind of pride in the limits of their knowledge. Mm-hmm. And that kind of trust, a trust that says, I see that you're restrained and therefore I take you seriously, is achieved by functional institutions. And it is liberating. Without it, it's very, very difficult for society to function. It's very difficult for people to trust each other. Mm-hmm. And trust makes freedom possible.
So it is hard to talk about failing institutions really without talking about higher education. You already mentioned it, especially in light of what's been going on campus since October 7th, the terrorist attack in Israel. So I have two questions on that front, both of which I posed to the student panel in one way, shape, or form. So the first one is, what role is our higher education system supposed to be filling? And have our higher education institutions been filling that role in your perspective?
I would say very broadly, and understanding that this leaves a lot of things out, that the core purpose of the university is to pursue the truth through teaching and learning and form human beings and citizens in light of that truth. Through teaching and learning is very important. The work of the university has to be the work of teaching and learning in pursuit of the truth. That work requires a lot of room for inquiry and expression, that is, for having arguments about what the truth is in a way that takes opposing views seriously. But there are also some boundaries. There are things that happen on campus that cannot be excused as being in pursuit of the truth through teaching and learning. And some of those things just don't belong on campus as a result. I think it makes a lot of sense that we've been talking a lot about free expression and free speech in thinking about what's wrong with the university, because a lot of times the university, when it's strayed from its purpose, has done that by means that are frankly authoritarian, by uses of administrative power that constrain the range of who's allowed on campus, or that force people into kind of incantations of statements of belief that they don't actually share. These are abuses of power, and it is important to insist on freedom in the face of abuses of power. But the purpose isn't freedom per se. The university is not just another place to express yourself. We have a lot of places to express yourself in our society. That's not what we lack. But I think we do lack places where we can pursue the truth through teaching and learning. What went wrong in the wake of October 7th is intimidation, is the abuse of Jewish students on a lot of campuses in ways that make it impossible for the university to function as a venue for pursuing the truth through teaching and learning. What went wrong in the 10 years that preceded October 7th are all kinds of abuses of administrative power that also made it impossible for the university to be a place where we pursue the truth through teaching and learning. The issue at stake there is not free expression. The issue at stake there is the purpose of the university.
Is there reason for hope, right? Is there, you touched on this earlier about solutions.
Yeah.
With regard to the university, what is the solution? How do you make an impact that seems to be generational or even multi-generational in the outlook of what the purpose of a university is by the very people who make the university work.
I think there's something to be learned from the way in which this revolution happened, which is that people with a different view of the university came to inhabit the institution, came to have places within it. I think the way forward for academic traditionalists, for people who think the purpose of the university is to pursue the truth through teaching and learning, is to inhabit the university, not to destroy it, not to burn it down, but to create space within it for people like themselves. That's very hard to do in a lot of elite institutions because the administrators of the university resist it. But I do think there's cause for hope, because I think what we're seeing in this moment is, for example, a kind of movement in a number of public universities, especially in Republican-run states, to create precisely space within the university for a more traditional attitude about its purpose. So the rise of these kind of civic thought institutes at places like the University of Texas, the University of Florida, in North Carolina, in Ohio, in Tennessee, these are new schools within the university. So they're not just little programs, so those matter too, as people at the Buckley program know. They're very important. But these are schools that can hire, that can give tenure, that can grant degrees, and they're run from the outset by academic traditionalists, by people who have that old-fashioned view of what the university is for. They're creating space within a larger university for this kind of model to operate. I think that it will be very attractive to students. I think it will create communities of teachers that will be very powerful and significant. And I think that is ultimately the way to push back. And I think it shows us how to use political power in responsible ways in the universities, not to blow up the institution, not even to get rid of tenure or some other things that we might think about, but just to create space for the right kind of idea of the purpose of the university. I think it's a model that could be important in private universities over time too, if it turns out to be effective and attractive. And that civic thought, the way these institutions are thinking about what they do, is actually a kind of new academic discipline that is emerging around the civic needs of our society. And I think it has real promise. So I wouldn't suggest being a wild-eyed optimist about the future of the university. The university is in real trouble. But I do think that there are reasons for hope, and that those places that offer that hope are worth our energy and our work.
So I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I'll kind of give you this last question, which a little bit of a curveball, so I apologize if you're not as prepared for this one. But we are the Buckley Institute, so one of the things we ask our guests is about Bill Buckley himself and the impact he's had on your life. What connections do you have to him directly or indirectly through National Review, Firing Line, what have you?
Well, I didn't know Bill very well. We've met a few times, but I only got to know him a very slight bit at the end of his life. But the model that he set, the model of being an intellectually serious conservative who was interested in debate, was interested in arguing with people who disagree with you, it is a model that's very, very important to a lot of conservatives of my generation. And the institutions that he created, National Review first and foremost, but others too that he had a very important hand in, like ISI and others, I think offer a very, very valuable example of exactly what we started with, which is what institutions do in a free society. They allow like-minded people to operate in the world in a way that really makes a difference. I think Bill Buckley was a great believer in the importance and the power of institutions. He was a builder. He really responded to problems by starting something new that could function as an institution to allow people to matter. I think we all have a lot to learn from that, and it's certainly been a hugely important example for me.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Levin. I really appreciate you giving us some of your time.
Thanks very much.
That wraps up another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale. As always, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Tell your friends if they don't know about it. And always remember, for God, for country, and for Yale, in that order.